How do people kind of sum up? How do they evaluate? How do they make sense of these kinds of initiative, these kinds of studies in that kind of way? Well, under the first one, I put persuading policy. The story I told you, well, I hope I communicated sufficiently about creative partnerships and the kind of brokering of artists and other forms of creative practitioners in schools. Okay, the English government spent nearly 200 million quid on it. That's very nice. But the truth of the matter is, okay, it's been cut partly for ideological arguments we don't need to particularly go into. But partly it was cut because they set creative partnerships up because there was a concern that the national curriculum, that formal outcomes were restrictive, that they were strangling forms of creativity and creative learning. And yet, when it came down to it, it became very difficult in educational terms to talk about achievement and attainment in schools that wasn't simply measured by those hard attainment outcomes. And one of the things that I think is very interesting for Dusseldorp's and for other kinds of initiatives here is to keep finding a way where you can have access to a public discourse and a way of talking about kind of the values and meaning of learning that isn't just defined by hard stats about kind of outcomes. So that in England they've become completely obsessed with measuring progression. What percentage of kids can reach level X by age so-and-so? You have all this ahead of you. It's terrific. And, but however, what's interesting is I hope I described to you varied, different, local, imaginative interventions. What counted at the end of the day? Well, what counted at the end of the day was to an extent whether those schools could demonstrate that by engaging in these activities, their outcomes rose. And that's a little bit depressing, obviously, and a little bit distressing, because the whole point of it is to actually introduce other forms of, other metrics, other forms of describing and valuing learning that couldn't necessarily be summarised in the performance agenda. In terms of how what I call the not school spaces are valued, and I've worked on this for a long time, and it's very painful, is you have to keep on finding proxy measures for success. So you have to keep on trying to find ways of showing that X number of the young people you work with have got jobs in the next 6 months, which is a definition of success. Of course, that would be a lot more difficult now since there aren't any jobs for young people in the UK, but when there were, that was what counted. Or you get credit for young people who, you sort of get positive measures of negative achievement, so like not being involved in crime, not getting pregnant. Do you see what I mean? Those sorts of things. Now, these are very difficult to actually assess with any certainty, let's be honest. And they're difficult to assess over any period of time. The employment thing I find very difficult because that's great. I mean, obviously, I'm in favour of people getting jobs. But it doesn't really matter what happens 2 weeks after they leave you. It's what happens for the rest of their lives kind of thing. And again, it's very difficult to find forms of measurement that are publicly acceptable. One of the things I like best about Scandinavian countries, they appear to offer 10-year ways of working in these things, that you're allowed sort of 10 years to see the impact of something in that kind of sense. And finally, the point I want to make about the learning in the home and things like that is what I call the mainstreaming of out of school. And this is something that I'm particularly engaged with at the moment in work that I'm doing, about the ways in which, if as adults we're terribly interested in the things that young people get to in their free time, if you're making a video or playing involved in some gaming culture and all the rest of it, if I come along as a grown-up and say, that's very interesting, I can see you're learning something very valuable here, there's a problem about the ways in which the, for lack of a better word, the educationalization of all kind of leisure time, all kinds of creative activity. If I'm the state and I'm kind of gathering it all into me and I'm kind of trying to find ways to measure it. So in America, there's a huge initiative which I'm part of called funded by the MacArthur Foundation. And they're putting a huge amount of money into digital media learning, and they're particularly developing a badging process whereby you can get some sort of credits for self-accredited kind of digital activities outside of the school. These are all great. I'm not really being quite as cynical as I sound. But it's interesting that we're living through a time where there's a great interest in trying to incorporate forms of learning outside of school and kind of give it some sort of badging and accrediting that we're used to happening within the kind of formal education system, which speaks about a lot of anxiety in that kind of way.